Dear participants, welcome to this webinar lecture, which is also a presentation of one of the recent books written by our today's guest, Dr. Christopher Miller. My name is Dmytro Ishchenko, and I'm the director of the Kyiv School of Diplomatic Arts, which has the honor to host this event. The present meeting is a part of our school's ongoing project, Civic Education versus Disinformation, countering fake histories in international politics and propaganda. Our interest in this, I'd say, quest is to depict and specify the role of history in international relations. In exploring this incredibly vast subject, we focus on several phenomena. Our primary concern is with those representations of the past that are embedded into the foreign policies and doctrines of international actors. Perhaps due to the brutal war which is being waged against Ukraine, we, above all, seek to understand the impact of those historical and, or rather quasi-historical narratives that are used in the bids to justify the acts of aggression. In this regard, we cannot omit the historical development of the concepts and policies of various states that resulted in land grabs, expansion, and subjugation of other peoples. One of such cases is to be discussed now. The presenter is Dr. Christopher Miller, Associate Professor of International History at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and Eurasia Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where he also directs the academic inquiry into the Baltic and the Black Sea regions. Dr. Miller is the author of a number of books, including The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev and the Collapse of the USSR, and Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia, and his latest, Chip War, the fight for the world's most critical technology, which we are planning to discuss on a separate occasion in the middle of January, by the way. The current lecture is about Dr. Miller's work, We Shall Be Masters, Russian Pivots to East Asia, from Peter the Great to Putin. Harvard professor Sergei Plokhy, a renowned historian and a bestseller writer of history texts himself, described the aforementioned book with these words, quotation marks, in a panoramic account of 300 years of Russian history. Dr. Miller presents a Russia little known in the West, a Eurasian power that treats its Eastern calling as seriously as it does its Western one. Exceptionally well written and argued, We Shall Be Masters helps us understand Russia on its own terms and offers historical insight into the future of its relations with China, its main rival and occasional ally in the region and the world. The end of quotation. That is what will be talked over in a minute. But first, a few words about our audience. Our today's audience embraces the faculty members and students of 14 Ukrainian universities representing the entire country. Besides, we have the students of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and of the University of Toronto, as well as participants from Estonia, India, Denmark, and Greece. Please excuse me if someone's educational institution or country remained unnamed. We welcome all willing students and young professionals to take part in the subsequent practical seminar based on the themes into which we are to delve today. On the arrangements of the seminar, we will provide additional information. And now, I'm happy to give the floor to our guest, Dr. Christopher Miller, the author of We Shall Be Masters, Russian Pivots to East Asia from Peter the Great to Putin, the work about the contents of which we are very eager to learn. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to join you all today. I will start by sharing some of the conclusions from my research, but then at the end of our hour together, I'd welcome any thoughts or questions that you have in the audience. So I encourage you to place those in the Q&A box, and I look forward to discussing some of your thoughts as well. Perhaps to start, the title of the book that I wrote, We Shall Be Masters, I think is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's a quote from a famous Russian writer, Dostoevsky, who is perhaps less well known for quotes like these, more well known for his novels, but I think is also an interesting figure for analysis of Russian imperialism historically. Because of course, as the quote suggests, there's a dynamic of empire or imperialism that feeds throughout Dostoevsky's work. And the full quote that We Shall Be Masters is part of is that in Europe we are slaves, but in Asia we shall be masters, which Dostoevsky wrote in the 19th century. But in some ways that dynamic of Russia trying to achieve dominance in the parts of the world it considers its neighborhood as a means of compensating for the fact that it is not dominant on the world stage helps to explain much of Russian foreign policy and also much of Russian intellectual life for some of the past several centuries. So what I'd like to do in the next half an hour or so is to discuss some of the key drivers of Russian foreign policy towards East Asia over the past 3 centuries, from Peter the Great all the way up through the current Putin system, which is a period that, of course, has seen dramatic changes in Russia in terms of the governments that are involved, from the Tsarist period to the Soviet period up to the present, seen dramatic changes in how modern societies are structured in terms of the economic basis of society or the technologies of military power, but has also seen a striking amount of continuity, I think, in Russian foreign policy vis-a-vis East Asia over that 300 years. And the primary source of continuities are the following. First, Russia has, from the origins of this period up to the present day, had most of its foreign policy interests focused on Europe, not on Asia. Most of Russia's economic interests are in Europe, and that's still true today, despite war and sanctions. Most of Russia's cultural connections have been with Europe. Russia's elite has been educated in Europe, speaking European languages and often having extensive family and business connections in Europe. And Russia's military has been predominantly focused on the European theater for almost all of the last 300 years, with just a couple of years in which you could argue there was an exception. At the same time, however, Russia has repeatedly evinced major interest in playing a bigger role in Asian politics or East Asian politics. And as you chart the expansion of the Russian Empire under the days of czars like Peter or Catherine, and then the changes in Russian power projection capabilities and goals under the Soviet leadership and up to the present day, what you find is that there's a regular, almost cyclical demonstration of interest in playing a major role in East Asia that many Russian rulers have evinced. And that's something that's been fairly persistent from the days of Peter all the way up to the present. That regular interest in playing a role in Asia, and often in terms of Russia's ability to play a dominant role in Asia, has come up against many realities which make it difficult for Russia to do this. The first reality is that although Russia territorially is a country that is both in Europe and in Asia, in terms of infrastructure, population, economic weight and military footprint, Russia's mostly been focused in Europe. So Russian borders stretch to Asia, but the bulk of Russian society, government, and military power are and always have been in Europe. And that makes it difficult for Russia to project power in Asia in a sustainable fashion over long or even short periods of time. The second challenge that Russia has faced in Asia is that it has almost always struggled to build durable partnerships with any of the countries that have mattered in Asia. And instead, the trend in Russian relations in Asia has been the opposite of conflictual relations with the major Western powers who played a role in the Pacific, such as Britain in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, or the United States for most of the 20th century up to the present. Russia's had largely conflictual relationships with them, with Japan, with which Russia went to war multiple times in the 20th century and has had a very complex and conflictual relationship over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and also with China, where despite the current bromance, if you will, between President Putin and President Xi, the reality is that most of the historical relationship between Russia and China is one marked more by conflict than by cooperation. And of course, there is fluctuation in this relationship, but the historical trend line is one of skepticism, both in Russia and in China, about the durability of this relationship and about the other side's intentions. And I think if you look at the history of fluctuating Russia-China relations, it ought to make us skeptical about the long-term durability of the current Russia-China relationship. And that's particularly important this year, as of course, before Russia's attack on Ukraine in February 24th, the beginning of February 24th, President Xi and President Putin met on February 4th, 20 days in advance, and released a joint statement that was quite favorable to Russia and seemed to set the stage ideologically for Russia's war after that point. And quite recently, 2 weeks ago, if I recall correctly, Wang Yi, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met and issued another statement that was, again, quite very much an endorsement by China of Russia's position. But I don't think we should accept these diplomatic statements as the only data point in terms of charting Russia-China relations. And the historical track record suggests that there are other factors that impinge on Russian and Chinese views of the relationship that are also worth examining, and that suggest a much more tenuous future for the Russia-China relationship than the promises of perpetual friendship might suggest. So to explore these issues, what I'd like to do is lay out some of the key trends and events in the history of Russian engagement and empire building in East Asia. And of course, this is a trend that is not new, but is one that has developed over time as Russia has played, generally speaking, a bigger role in East Asia over the past several centuries. If you rewind the clock back over 500 years, Russia had no possessions whatsoever on the Pacific Ocean. And it was really only around the time of Peter the Great that Russia began to establish any sort of presence on the Pacific Ocean, with explorers who were searching for fur hunting grounds, establishing the first settlements in places like Kamchatka. And indeed, up until the end of the 18th century, the number of Russian government officials who were regularly on the Pacific coast was very, very few at all. And there was hardly any permanent presence whatsoever. But in the 19th century, from the earliest decades of that century, Russia made a much more serious effort to establish itself as a great power in East Asia. For a time, that involved Russia trying to build an empire that spanned across the Pacific Ocean. And indeed, for the first 2/3 of the 19th century, Russia controlled much of what is today the American state of Alaska, which Russia used as a territory for fur trapping and for fishing, supplying primary commodities back into the Russian economy. Russia also for a time had territory in the US state of California, just north of present-day San Francisco, where you can still visit the remains of the old Russian fort that was established there and existed for over 2 decades. And in addition to that, there was a brief period of time around the Napoleonic Wars in which Russia temporarily claimed control of one of the islands in the Hawaiian Islands chain. And so Russia was a imperial power par excellence during this period, competing with the British, the French, to a lesser extent, the Spaniards and the Americans to create empires in the Pacific Ocean. But it always struggled to do so because its ability to deploy maritime power, deploy naval power in the Pacific was quite limited because its only relevant naval bases were in Kronstadt near St. Petersburg, and to deploy naval power in the Pacific, it had to sail ships all the way around through the Indian Ocean up north into the Pacific Ocean. And so it was a very difficult way to wield naval power when your bases were so far away. And so Russia was beat back from its efforts to establish a trans-Pacific empire during this time period. And in the latter decades of the 19th century, changed its strategy to focus on asserting control over a bigger chunk of the Eurasian landmass in the Asia-Pacific region. And in the second half of the 19th century, Russian forces were able to wrest from the control of Qing China territories that today make up much of the Russian Far Eastern region, including the cities of Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, which at the time were part of territory nominally controlled by China's Qing Empire, but were taken over by the Russians via a series of military threats imposed against the Qing Empire. And although today in China and in the West, Western imperialism against China is often thought to be one of the most important trends in China's weakness in the late 19th century. And indeed, there were a series of British and French imperial wars against China during that time period. In fact, it was the Russians who took dramatically more territory from China and hold that territory to this day by taking advantage of the fact that Britain, France, and China were often at odds. And just as conflict between the European powers and China peaked, making their own demands, coupled with their own military threats against Qing China to wrest territorial control from China. And this left a very sour taste in the mouth of many Chinese. And although over the past century, largely due to the propaganda requirements of the People's Republic of China, which was set up by Mao Zedong in the 1940s, China's historical memory about imperialism, European imperialism in the 19th century has focused on the British and to a lesser extent the French as the primary imperialists in China. There are still many people in China who do recall that it's Russia that took more territory during the peak of Qing China's weakness. And indeed, at the lowest points of Russia-China relations during the 20th century, even friends of Russia like Mao Zedong, who was a friend of Russia for some time, reminded Russian leaders of the fact that, in his view, they occupied territory that was rightly China's, pointing not only to Vladivostok, over which China did have a plausible claim, but Mao at one point also described Kamchatka as a Chinese territory, which I think you'll have to really stretch your historical imagination to devise a plausible Chinese claim to Kamchatka. But the fact that Mao Zedong cited that is a reminder that although these borders are demarcated now via a series of agreements between the Russian and Chinese governments, neither Russia nor China is fully convinced that they're settled in a broader historical context. And I think it's striking the extent to which, if you read local media in the Russian Far East or in Siberia and listen to local politicians in the region, the extent to which fear of China is much more elevated than what you get elsewhere in Russia, precisely for these purposes. And although I think it's easy to overestimate the likelihood that China tries to resuscitate these historical demands on Russian territory. The fact is that Russians in these regions remain quite concerned about how durable Moscow's hold over them actually is, and about whether, as Russian power declines and Chinese power grows over the coming decade, whether Russia's hold over them might become less important. Alongside that fact, to finish up the discussion of Russia-China relations around the borderlands, is the fact that today these territories are more economically reliant on China than ever before. And so even if China doesn't try to exercise political leverage over Russia in these areas, it already is exercising substantial economic leverage over Russia. And that's a part of the Russia-China relationship that's become more important over the past couple of years. If you turn your attention away from the Pacific coast and towards parts of Central Asia, and in particular parts of Central Asia that today China governs, what you'll find here too is a long track record of contestation and even open warfare between Russia and China. The territory that China now calls Xinjiang, which constitutes much of the western portion of China, is a territory that historically Russia has exercised great influence in. And at multiple times in the past century and a half, Russian forces have occupied militarily for some period of time. And indeed, although if you look at a map today, the map will suggest to you that China's sovereignty and control over Xinjiang is as solid as its control over any other province in China. The reality is that China's leaders are deeply fearful of the durability of their hold over Xinjiang, which is why they've, over the past half decade or so, imposed a very repressive policy of incarcerating hundreds of thousands and at a peak several million Uyghurs, ethnic minorities, during that period, because China's leaders are afraid that, in fact, their hold of Xinjiang is not nearly as tight as a quick glance of the map might suggest. And the greatest fear of China's leaders today is of Uyghur separatism. But historically, Uyghur separatism has been intimately linked with the aims of other empires in the region on Xinjiang. And in the past, there have been two other empires that have played a big role in Xinjiang politics besides China. The first is the government of India, which for most of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century was a British government. But one of the things that you find, which is quite interesting, is the extent to which British rulers of India thought very hard about Xinjiang, precisely because it was on their border as they ruled India. And then Russia is the second power that's played a major role in Xinjiang over the past 150 years. And at periods of peak Chinese weakness over the past century and a half, Russia has, on two different occasions, asserted itself militarily into Xinjiang politics with the explicit aim of weakening the Chinese government's control over this province. First in the 1870s, in a point of crisis in the Qing Empire's governance across all of China, but especially in Xinjiang, the Russian imperial government occupied for a decade a substantial chunk of Xinjiang province called the Ili Valley, which was an important trading center for both Xinjiang and the rest of Central Asia, and was only evicted out of this territory after China threatened to go to war against Russia with British support in the late 1870s and early 1880s. And then a half century after that point, in the 1930s, again, when China faced immense weakness as the Chinese Republic struggled to assert control over various warlords who governed different provinces of China, and then after Japan invaded eastern China, further weakening the Chinese government, the Soviet Union occupied Xinjiang, deploying troops, tanks, military aircraft in Xinjiang for most of the 1930s, propping up the quote-unquote provincial governor of Xinjiang, who in theory was a governor who reported to the Chinese government, but who also simultaneously applied and was eventually accepted into membership in the Soviet Union's Communist Party, suggesting that he was actually more responsive in many ways to leaders in Moscow than leaders in Beijing. And this history is not well known outside of China. Certainly in the West, very few people think about Soviet interventions in Xinjiang on a regular basis. But in China, this history is very well known, and its contemporary relevance is seen to be significant, which is why China very jealously guards its sovereignty over Xinjiang, but also why it looks skeptically at Russia as an actor in Central Asia. Now, over the past decade, Russia has been very deferential to China when it comes to questions of Xinjiang, when it comes to questions of Central Asia in general. Russia's evinced no concern whatsoever for the fate of Xinjiang's Uyghur and Kazakh minorities who have faced quite ruthless Chinese repression. It has helped via the Shanghai Cooperation Organization China to institute a campaign of transnational repression against Uyghur activists who have fled elsewhere in Central Asia and further abroad. But it's also the case that Chinese leaders know that this policy is easily reversible. And indeed, in the Soviet period, even after the Soviet Union pulled its troops out of China's Xinjiang, it still continued to retain connections to Xinjiang independence leaders for most of the Soviet period. And there's some risk, I think, that the Chinese leaders see that if China were to face further pressure over its control over Xinjiang, Russia could again emerge as a country that might challenge its control over that region. Not something that is urgently relevant, but something that in the future is something we should not count out, precisely because it's happened repeatedly over the past 150 years. When you look more broadly in Central Asia, though, what you find today is that it's China, which is the rising power, and Russia, which is the declining power. And this is no more visible than in the parts of Central Asia that had been republics of the former Soviet Union, and as a result had been deeply integrated into Russian imperial control, but which over the past several decades, and especially over the past year, have found really substantial ways to lessen Russian influence over their politics. You see this in Uzbekistan, you see this very substantially in Kazakhstan, even countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which are very economically weak and reliant on economic connections with Russia, have been asserting more independence now because they can, because they know Russia today is weak, weaker than it's been at any point since 1991, and perhaps since well before that point. And so the states of Central Asia have been able to play Russia and China off of each other, taking advantage of China's growing economic influence and growing political influence to push out Russia to some extent from the region. And for a long time, the Russians promoted the notion that the Chinese did economics in Central Asia and the Russians did security, and that there was a division of labor between Russian and Chinese actions in Central Asia. But that's no longer a viable claim to make, because there's been a dramatic expansion over the past half decade of Chinese security presence in Central Asia. Private security companies, Chinese military trainers in Tajikistan and other countries in Central Asia, a vast expansion of joint military exercises between Central Asian states and China, all of which gives these countries more flexibility and more options as they wish to push against Russian influence. And so the trend line recently has been a declining Russian influence in Central Asia relative to a rising Chinese influence. And I think this trend is likely to persist, at least for the next couple of years, as Russia remains comparatively weak and as China, as a result, sees its relative power in the region grow. So when you put these two trends together, the dynamic in the Pacific coast and in East Asia, where Russia and China have historic rivalries, and there's ongoing concern about Chinese power in the Russian Far East and in Siberia. There's also longstanding reliance on Chinese economic influence to buy the commodities that Russia produces, next to the similar dynamic in Chinese Central Asia and Xinjiang, where there's similar historical tensions and concerns about sovereignty, coupled with a declining amount of Russian influence and rising Chinese power. What you find is that the deep friendship that is professed by Russian and Chinese leaders doesn't always map on perfectly to the dynamics in practice. And rather than a deep friendship or partnership defining Russia-China relations over the past decade, what I would suggest is more accurate, is that Russia has been very lenient with regard to China as China dramatically expands its influence in spheres that Russia used to think were its own special zone of control. And I think what is especially striking is the extent to which this relationship has become even more one-sided over the past year. It's been one-sided for most of the last decade as China's reaped most of the diplomatic benefits, and Russia has paid for this in terms of lost influence in Central Asia in particular. This year, you find that China has supported Russia by issuing statements, whereas Russia has supported China by selling China, for example, vast quantities of cut-priced oil and natural gas and other commodities. Well, China's really done nothing to support Russia openly during the war. It's rhetorically supported Russia, continued to trade with Russia, but it hasn't sent any military supplies that we are aware of to Russia. And the fact that Russia is relying on artillery sourced from North Korea and drones bought from Iran suggests that they are unable to buy both of these from China. And so this, I think, shows the limits of the Russian-Chinese partnership today. The two presidents, when they meet, or the foreign ministers, when they meet, might declare themselves all-weather friends. But the reality is, in Russia's time of need, as it struggles to fight the war that it started, China has not been very helpful at all, and has not at all gone out of its way to provide any sort of support for Russia beyond rhetoric and statements. And I think this is a matter of some disappointment to the Kremlin today, which had hoped that its friendship with China was more meaningful than it turned out to be. But if you zoom out from beyond Putin and his close circle of advisors, you find even more skepticism among the broader Russian elite about the relationship with China, because it's obvious to anyone who looks at the question with an objective lens that Russia has lost leverage, China has gained leverage, and Russia's bet on deepening relations with China has not delivered the gains in geopolitical terms or in diplomatic terms that Russia has hoped for. So I think it's already clear that the Putin-era strategy of pivoting towards China has been diplomatically a failure. It's provided some positive diplomatic benefits to Russia in terms of statements of support, but in terms of actual substantive help, it hasn't provided much at all. And it's left Russia more dependent than ever before on its friendship with China. And that friendship is not really defined by friendliness, but defined by interests. And so the Chinese are getting a better and better deal in all sorts of negotiations with Russia at Russia's expense, which is getting not much in exchange. And this puts Russia, I think, in an interesting position. Of course, now with the war ongoing and with Putin's control over the policymaking process more centralized than ever, it's very difficult for anyone, or very dangerous for anyone, to openly question the extent to which Putin has gone all in on relations with China. And I think if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find widespread skepticism this was the right policy for Russia to have undertaken, and a realization by many in the Russian elite that over the next 5 or 10 years, they'll need to reorient their relationship with China, rebalance it so that they end up in a less vulnerable position vis-a-vis the Chinese. And as I mentioned, they're quite vulnerable today because they've got basically no other friends or trading partners that they can rely on besides the Iranians and the North Koreans, who are the only other countries supplying them with weaponry, for example, that we're aware of. So the Russia-China relationship has historically been defined by Russian hope that going back to Dostoevsky, we shall be masters. But the irony today is that Russia's optimism in Asia has been misplaced. The bet on relations with Xi's China has gone well for Xi, but not so well for Russia. And if you had to ask the question of which country will be the master of the future of the Russia-China relationship, I think it very clearly wouldn't be Russia. Because the reality is that today Xi's China has all of the leverage. Putin's Russia has far less than it had hoped. And the future of the Russia-China relationship will be defined first by the answer to the question of how far China is willing to push Russia to take advantage of Russia's weakness right now. And second, what mechanisms, if any, Russia has to get out of its current isolation vis-a-vis the West, which is the only hope it has of rebalancing its relationship with China over the long term. So perhaps with those comments, I'll stop there and welcome any questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you. And while the members of the audience are going to write their questions in the Q&A section below, which you may find below, I will usurp my right as a moderator to start with my questions. And the first one will be that of a historian rather than of an international relations expert. In your book, you describe the history of Russian policies, Russian expansion, Russian pivots in East Asia, and you have structured the book thus that you show certain stages of that policy's development, and each stage had its particular concept, some conceptualization. They argued their policies in a certain way. Could you please mention those concepts of each particular stage of that Russian ambition to move to become a master in East Asia?
Well, you find that there are different concepts in different periods. Sometimes they're focused more on territorial conquest, which had been the trend in East Asian policy for Russia in the past, in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Over the last 70 years or so, Russia has focused less on territorial conquest, although I think that is driven not by a shift in Russia's willingness to try territorial conquest, but rather a shift in the balance of power that has made it impossible for Russia to succeed in East Asia. But there are other concepts as well. Some have focused on economic imperialism and the construction of infrastructure that tries to lock in other countries into Russia's sphere of control. There's been imperialism driven by Russian expansion of settlers in regions, and especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was lots of movement of populations around, both ethnic Russians being settled in the Far East, Gulag prisoners being settled in the Far East, which was a major impetus for movement to that territory, and then also a series of ethnic cleansings, largely by Stalin, but also by some other Russian leaders, of ethnic Korean populations, for example, or ethnic Chinese populations from territories where they lived in the Far East, elsewhere throughout the Russian or Soviet empire. So there have been different tools that the Russians have used over time to assert their influence in Asia, sometimes military, sometimes focused on territorial expansion, sometimes economic in focus, and other times focused on populations and in actually establishing settlers to populate a given area.
And with regard to pursuing a certain policy, which was constructed by, if it is a policy, it was constructed by what was the political elite in Russia. And that political elite, and then those who implemented the policy in the region, the policy of expansion or taking of control of taking the control of certain territories, those people, Russians, they had certain attitudes toward the peoples, the nations of the region. And would you say those attitudes, and in particular a certain air of superiority, something that is reflected in that quote you used from Dostoevsky, the ambition to be masters, and did those attitudes that idea of Russia's superiority, or the superiority of the Russians over the nations of the region, did that play, or what role that attitude played in the construction of certain policies and their implementation?
Yeah, it's a key question, and it's been quite important in shaping Russian views. It has changed over time, the extent and the ways in which Russian leaders asserted superiority over other countries in Asia. At times, especially in the 19th century, it was a very straightforward, racially driven imperialism and sense of superiority. In the 20th century, it was largely expressed via ideological assertions of superiority, and especially with regards to the Soviet Union. There was a sense that the Soviet Union knew exactly what politics ought to be like, and the Chinese communists ought simply to listen to whatever they said. Over the past couple of decades, I think the more racially tinged versions of Russian superiority have come to the fore again, and especially in the Russian Far East at the popular level. I think what you find often is a deep-set racial fear of other countries' populaces that are in the region, and that drives the sense of superiority that emerges. I think if you look at Russian elites today, that's less relevant. If you're looking at elites in Moscow, that's more of the popular sentiment in Siberia or in the Far East. And from the perspective of elites today, I think there's a realization that Russia is far from superior vis-a-vis China. And actually, the challenge now is coming to terms, I think, with the extent to which it's China, not Russia, that is setting the agenda in East Asia, and countries like Korea and Japan as well, which in the past Russia had seen as countries that ought to follow Russian preferences, or that were in some cases second tier to Russia, are today have much more vibrant economies and a very strong political ability to push back against Russian demands. And so the Russian sense of superiority, I think, is being tested right now as Russian power in Asia declines dramatically and looks unlikely to recover anytime soon.
And my next question is, in the capacity of an international relations expert, and that will have a tendency to a tendency or connection to the practical side of our work. As I know, in our audience, we have the faculty members of a number of Ukrainian universities, including some senior professors representing the IR departments, who are at the same time as historians. And I'm absolutely sure that just like myself, they welcome wholeheartedly your approach and your research. And that gives us very interesting food for thought, as Ukrainians, food for thought with regard to, in relation to how we can use that in practice for promoting the current topical urgent interests of Ukraine. And in that practical context, what is your view concerning the practical application of such knowledge, of the knowledge of the evolution of certain political mentality, that of the Russian elites, and the political mentality, or let's say the knowledge about the reaction caused by Russian policies in the region? Are we able to apply that knowledge in in the present day politics in the region. For instance, well, it will be a provocative part of the question. If there are some unnamed international actors interested in in weakening the ties between China and Russia, would they be able to allude to, or in some other ways to use the problematic moments in Russia-China history and their relations in the past, and such things as, for instance, Russia's previous feeling of superiority and its actions as a imperialist player. Would we be able to use that for weakening Russia-China's relations and constructing a certain narrative that would create a certain, well, the comprehension of the players of the states in the region, which is different than the one that exists now?
Well, I think that's a key question. I think there are two ways that I would look at that. I think the first is that in many parts of the world, in many parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, but also in the West, imperialism is seen to be something that only happened in European history, when in fact it's happening not only in Russian history, but in the Russian present. And I think the more that that historians can do to help people understand that Russia is not only historically an empire, but is acting along the same impulses today, the more accurate an understanding we'll have of what actually Russia is doing. And so I think that is absolutely crucial, helping to put Russian politics today in proper imperial perspective will have a major impact on how people perceive what Russia's doing. And so I would encourage everyone to think in those terms. I think in this audience, no one has any difficulty understanding what that means in practice. But I am struck, talking to audiences from other countries, the extent to which Russia and imperialism are seen to be words that don't fit together, because imperialism is something that only the British and the French did. And that, of course, is a very skewed and narrow reading of history that doesn't actually fit reality. And so looking at Russia and the Asia Pacific region historically shows that actually Russia was doing the exact same thing that other imperial powers were doing at the exact same time historically, and is using the exact same techniques in many ways today as well. So making sure everyone understands the imperial nature of the Russian state, past and present, I think is one takeaway. The second, I think, is to focus on the difficulties Russia currently is facing in Asia, many of which are happening on their own, given the Russian decision to start this war and other countries' responses to it. And so if you look at Russia's relations with Japan and Korea, for example, they're the worst they've been in a very long time, precisely because of the war. But also, if you look at Russia's position in Central Asia, as I mentioned, it's the lowest it's been in a very long time, since arguably 1991 or 1992, and maybe even before that. And I think there's a lot of scope for Ukraine, also for Western countries, to do more to help Central Asian countries pry themselves free from Russia's influence, which will in the process weaken Russia's ability to play the role of great power on the world stage. And so I think that ought to be a focus of ours going forward, in terms of thinking about how can we make sure that Russia's influence in that region declines further. And finally, with regards to China, I think we ought to be skeptical of the claims from Russian and Chinese leaders about their perpetual friendship. And the more I think we can do to point out the gaps in this narrative, the more it will become apparent to those who haven't realized in Russia and in China that this is in fact more illusion than reality. And that will be, I think, useful in terms of shaping how both Beijing and Moscow respond. Now, I think we also must not be naive in hoping that the relationship between Russia and China is going to disappear anytime soon. But we have also seen a lot of practical limits to that relationship that have been much more pronounced than the rhetoric might suggest. And so pointing out the gaps between rhetoric and substance, I think, is crucial to understanding the Russia-China relationship, and also puncturing some of the more propagandistic claims of Russia-China alignment, when in fact there's a lot of the opposite that's been visible over the past 8 months since Russia started the war.
And the question in continuation to the previous ones, and I think it will be the last one from me, and we'll proceed with the questions from the audience. But my last question is, in the change, if we talk about the nearest future, I'd say that many analysts and observers come to the conclusion that the changes there are inevitable, practically because of the changes that are bound to happen in Russia or around Russia, and they would affect the countries which you mentioned, the countries of Central Asia and China as well. Do you think they will have to make changes to renovate, upgrade their current policies to foreign policies towards Russia? What role, what is your personal opinion about the role that might be played in that upgrade by historical memory in those countries? Will that role be significant, or is it just something rather marginal? If it's not, if it is going to be a significant element of the changes in policies and attitudes towards Russia, and probably towards the relations in the region, what do you think we can do about that as well, I'd say, as educators? Should we make the study of historical memory politics, and with particular case studies, a part of typical IR education worldwide?
Well, I think they certainly ought to be. Whether that will have a direct impact on politics in the short run perhaps might be too optimistic, just given the time it takes for education to filter into practical politics. But I certainly think an accurate historical memory about how the Russian Empire was created and how it's developed over time is crucial to understanding where we are today.
So we'll have to pay some attention to historical memories.
I certainly believe so, especially over the long run. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. That's the idea the Kyiv School of Diplomatic Arts has been promoting for some time, and it's good to have your support in that matter. And I will take a look what the members of the audience have written, and if it's all right, I will read the questions and so everybody.
Dmitry, I need to wrap up at the end of the hour, so perhaps I can try to address some of the final questions in quick succession, if that works.
All right. Okay. Well, the first one is from Mr. Volodymyr Panchenko. What is your opinion of the idea that Russia will split into several states, widely discussed by Western experts? When and how China could be interested in having a stake of the process? 2035, 2040?
Well, let me try to answer that one, as well as Ihor's question about Xinjiang as well, since they're related. I think we ought to be skeptical of large-scale border changes in either Russia or China. And I think if you look at most countries in the Eurasian region, there is not much desire to have large-scale border changes, because all of the countries in Eurasia would find their borders up in question if, in fact, you did have large-scale border changes in Russia or China or any other major country in the world. So I think we should be dubious of this as a prediction for the future. That doesn't mean that no border changes are possible, but breaking into pieces seems like not the most likely outcome.
All right, and one of the questions is about the next great master in Asia. Who will that be? And that is a good question. And there is another question about the other actors in Far East or East Asia region. What role will they play?
Well, I think the second question on other actors is the right question to ask, because I don't think we should expect Asia to have one master, if you will. And in fact, the trend has been of multiple countries shaping how Asian politics have developed. I think Japan is a great example of this. Japan's played a major role in reshaping the geopolitical landscape in East Asia over the last half a decade, especially since Shinzo Abe and his second term as prime minister. But no one would call Japan the dominant player in Asia, of course. It's less influential than both the US and China, but nevertheless, it's had an important role. So if you look at Japan, Korea, in particular, I think you see states that are not the big powers necessarily playing a large role actually in shaping the political and military balance.
And I see a good but rather long question from a master student of the University of Toronto, Sean Waddingham. He actually has a couple of questions, and the second half of this question is about why Russia did not try gradual pragmatic economic reform like that of China. And that is probably where we have to refer the audience to one of the aforementioned books by Chris Miller about Soviet economy. I think it's there in that book you explain why Russia did not manage to do what China did. So yes, that would be a good idea to read that in detail. Perhaps we can have a separate discussion of that if it's the interest from the audience. And I see the question from the same member of the audience about the Russian ideology of superiority and whether it may have backfired in the maintaining of the world power status. Well, this is something that I urge to discuss during our practical seminars, so let's remember that, and maybe you will give your view on that.
Well, I think, has it backfired? I don't know that it's backfired yet. I think what you find is that historically it often backfired, but right now, the key thing that's backfired is not Russia's sense of superiority, but Russia's inability to see clearly power dynamics relative to itself and to China. So over the past decade, that's been the key challenge of Russian foreign policy, is that its foreign policy has driven itself to an ever weaker state vis-a-vis China, without really fully coming to terms with the ramifications. And so that, I think, is the big error that Russian elites have made over the past decade.
I think, have I understood correctly? You will have to finish now, yeah?
Unfortunately, I'm supposed to go to another lecture, yes.
Okay, so we do not have a right to take any more of your time, but we'll hope to continue that. And as we have agreed, and I've already mentioned that in January, we will have the discussion of your latest book, and we invite everybody present here, and hopefully there will be less problems with our energy and electricity systems, so more of our audiences will be able to join. And for now, thank you very much. And as I said, we will send the information about our practical seminar to all the participants, and those who would like to join are very welcome to do so. Thanks again, and we'll be looking forward to our next meeting in January, and I hope that our students will go ahead and start reading your books directly, which is always a good thing.
Well, thank you again for having me, and I look forward to the session in January.
Thank you very much, and bye. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
And thanks, everybody. If you have any questions, please use the email from which we have sent our invitations, and or connect us via telephone, which is indicated in our contact information. And as I said, we will be sending you the information about our practical seminar. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Till next.